Important update on the constitutional crisis that Israel is going through right now. The Supreme Court had a hearing a couple of days ago. Before we go on, make sure to go into the description of this video below and download the free ebook that is available there. This is a collection of columns that I've published over the course of the last year and a half since the beginning of the October 7th war. It really gives you a feel, like almost like a diary, gives you a feel for everything we've been through in this war. So go ahead and download that ebook. If you haven't seen the two previous videos that we've done on this whole scandal, this whole struggle that's going on between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the cabinet on the one hand, and the Supreme Court and the Attorney General on the other hand, go watch those two videos right now. So a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court held a hearing to discuss the efforts by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the cabinet to fire Ronen Bar. And right at the outset of the hearing, the Supreme Court acknowledged that the authority to fire Ronen Bar, to fire the head of the Shin Bet, lies with the Prime Minister and lies with the government, and that they can do that, that is their authority and not the Supreme Court's. But they went on to say that they are having the hearing to determine whether or not the correct procedures were followed. And the lawyer on behalf of the government, Ronen Bar, in his opening statement, discussed the fact that the Supreme Court is overstepping its bounds, that the Supreme Court really has no authority to tell the government who can be the head of the Shin Bet. Let's recall that in 2002, there was a law passed called the Shin Bet Law, which lays out the procedures for hiring and firing and other aspects of governance, of the government's governance of the Shin Bet. And in that law, it states clearly that the head of the Shin Bet can be fired by the Prime Minister at any time without any cause. Now, why would he be able to be fired without any cause? Because the head of the Shin Bet, the General Security Services of Israel, having a trusted, close working relationship with the Prime Minister is absolutely essential. And therefore, it's understood that for national security, it being so essential that they have a trusting relationship, the Prime Minister has the ability by law to fire the head of the Shin Bet at any time for any reason. The law doesn't say what procedures have to be gone through for the Prime Minister to fire the head of the Shin Bet. And yet, the Supreme Court went through a whole discussion of whether or not the appropriate procedures were followed, and the ruling the Supreme Court came to at the end of this lengthy hearing the other day, that Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot fire the head of the Shin Bet at this time, and they are putting a stay on the firing of the head of the Shin Bet until further notice, because they want to continue to investigate whether or not the proper procedures were followed, and they're saying that he should have had a hearing in front of a personnel board. The problem is that none of this is in the law. Now, here's where I believe the government messed up. The real issue, the real disagreement between the government and the Supreme Court is over the question of authority. Does the Supreme Court have the authority to tell the executive branch, to tell the government, to tell the cabinet that they cannot fire the head of the Shin Bet? And the government's argument is that they don't even have that authority. And therefore, I believe that the government's position in this hearing should have been to come in for Ronen Bar to make that opening statement and say this entire hearing is illegal because the Supreme Court doesn't even have the authority to tell the Prime Minister whether or not he can fire the head of the Shin Bet, and the hearing should have ended right there. And to every question that the Supreme Court asked, the answer should have been, it doesn't matter, you have no right to tell the government what they can and can't do when it comes to firing the head of the Shin Bet and hiring a replacement. But instead, the hearing turned into an investigation into the reasons why Ronen Bar was fired and how bad was his negligence when it came to October 7th. And is this grounds for his dismissal? Is it not grounds for his dismissal? Are there procedures that should have been followed that weren't followed? And the government responded to these questions. And taking part in that hearing and giving some credibility to those questions itself is a mistake by the government. because that itself lends legitimacy to the idea that the Supreme Court has the authority to evaluate the reasons why the head of the Shin Bet was being fired. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's response to this hearing, on the one hand, to put out a statement saying that he thought that the whole hearing was superfluous because the Supreme Court doesn't have that authority, but at the same time saying that he's going to respect the authority of the court. He's going to hold back on actually implementing the firing of Ronen Bar while he is interviewing replacements. And there are a number of ministers in the coalition and other members of Knesset from the coalition parties that, since the hearing took place 2 days ago, have been calling for the government to disregard the ruling of the Supreme Court altogether because it's invalid, including Bezalel Smotrich from the National Religious Party, who's the finance minister, who has said the Supreme Court cannot force the prime minister to work with Ronen Bar as the head of the Shin Bet. So he might still continue to get a paycheck and officially call himself the head of the Shin Bet, but he must be disqualified from all briefings and from all government meetings and essentially treated as someone who's no longer the head of the General Security Services of the Shin Bet. I believe that what needs to happen right now for the government to openly defy the ruling of the Supreme Court, to fire Ronen Bar, don't let him into the building, tell the Supreme Court that their ruling is invalid, and they need to do this not only because of this particular issue of the firing of Ronen Bar and for the national security implications of having a head of the Shin Bet who is out of favor with the prime minister, but also to break the judicial oligarchy that Israel currently lives under. As I explained in a previous video, the Supreme Court has usurped powers for itself that it is not meant to have in telling the government what they can do, in trying to micromanage the government's decisions. And the only way to really break that oligarchy is for one of these illegal orders of the Supreme Court, which is what this is, to be simply ignored. So this crisis is still ongoing. We're going to continue to bring you updates.